Memoir of Klaus Mueller. It was the night of May 21st, 1980. The air in the East German pine forest felt thick as we drove down the dark dirt road. There were 4 of us East German police in the truck, with the 6 dissenters cuffed in the back. The senior officer and I rode in the front, while 2 other men sat with the prisoners. At the time, I was still a very young man, only a year into 20. I'd only just recently completed all my training and been put on the East German police force. It had been something I'd aspired to for nearly my whole life. The kind of society I found myself born into, I was sure that the only way to survive was to take authority. I didn't want to be just another citizen crushed underfoot. I wanted to be the one doing the crushing. Of course, I still wasn't sure about the kind of things I'd be asked to do. I heard stories that made my skin crawl about what us police would be ordered to do to people. My immediate reaction was to think, I never want to do that. But I did everything I could to push those feelings aside. I wanted to be strong. I wanted to be a valuable member of the society. I tried to make myself believe that those in command knew better than me. I told myself that I didn't like their orders only because I was foolish. That night, May 1980, was the first time I'd been sent out to do an execution. In the few months I'd been stationed in Erfurt, I'd done my fair share of genuine police work, as well as genuine cruelty. I did a pretty good job of it, too. I guess that's why they selected me, of all people, to join them on their trip out into the woods that night. But, despite how well I was accustoming myself to the police force, a secret execution of untried prisoners made me feel uneasy. Still, I had no intention of obstructing my brothers from doing what I knew would be done with or without me. We drove our way through the pine woods and stopped before a tall, barbed wire fence. The fence blocked off a large square of the forest and had big signs all along it that read, Regierungsland, nicht geben, government land, do not enter. Once we arrived at this desolate point, we stopped the truck and got out. I took my rifle in hand, and the senior officer took a big flashlight. I also felt on my left breast for my large army knife. I could feel the knife in its sheath under my uniform coat. It provided me with some comfort. The knife had been my father's when he fought in the war. I always carried it on me in case of emergency. It made me feel safe. Having armed ourselves, the senior officer and I walked around to the back of the truck. As I rounded the long vehicle, I thought I heard a twig snap somewhere in the trees behind me. I turned to look, but saw nothing. I assumed that it was because I felt so nervous. I gritted my teeth and focused on what was before me. As we came to the back of the truck, my commanding officer pulled back the tarp and beckoned the men within to bring the prisoners out. "Get them out here," he said gruffly in German. The 2 men led the 6 prisoners, all of whom were white as a sheet, out of the back of the vehicle and into the woods. We led them along the barbed wire fence toward a gate a little down the road. The 2 men kept a hold of the prisoners while I followed from behind, with my weapon trained on them. The senior officer led our way with his light. We led the prisoners through the gate into the fenced-off woods. I was commanded to securely shut and lock the gate behind us. I carried out the task promptly. Then, on we went into the dark forest. The commanding officer held his flashlight steady to lead our way through the otherwise almost pitch-black wood. There was no moon in the sky, and if there had been, it would have been obscured by all the clouds. Our leader was our only source of light. After a few minutes of walking, we finally came to a stop in a little hollow. I immediately noticed the soil was very loose under my feet. I couldn't understand it at first, but then it dawned on me. I gulped as I realized that the whole area was probably blocked off to protect this little hollow. It was a private execution spot and a cemetery with no graves. A dreadful shiver ran through me as I heard a muffled crunch from beneath a certain spot of dirt on which I stepped. Despite my nearly overwhelming uneasiness, I continued to carry out my job. I feigned apathy as I kept my weapon steadily trained on the 6 people in cuffs. As I stared at them over a sight, for the first time I began to examine them more closely. Of the 6, 4 were men and 2 were women. 2 of the men were quite young, one looked in his middle years, and the other was an elderly man. Of the women, one was upper middle-aged, verging on elderly, while the other was very young. As I examined the younger of the females, I began to realize that she could hardly have been called a woman. She was a girl. Her face was smooth and fair, and her figure was little. Beneath the bruised eye and greasy, disheveled hair, I could almost see a pretty face. But now, like the other 5, the face only showed an expression of utter terror. She was past the brink of tears now. She quivered with fear as tears periodically rolled down her face. Like the rest, she stared down at the dirt. In all their eyes I saw a look of fearful resignation. They knew this was the end of them, and that they could do nothing about it. All they could do was try to imagine fairer times when they were happy. I began, quite against my will, to feel sorry for what we were doing. These were lives that still had potential, some even more than others, and we were just snuffing them out without a hearing or trial of any kind. The only thing that deemed them worthy of this fate was the whims of a few powerful men. I made myself look away from the prisoners at this point. I couldn't tolerate the treacherous thoughts that their sad visages were bringing to me. "Line up and get on your knees," barked one of the 2 officers at the prisoners. As they were instructed, the prisoners lined up, side by side, and got to their knees. The 2 officers positioned themselves at either end of the line. From their belts, both the officers pulled out their sidearms. They too trained the weapons on the prisoners. The commanding officer stood in front of the line of prisoners. I watched from behind the line as he took his light in one hand and pulled a pistol from his holster with the other. He walked up to the older man, who happened to be on the end of the line, and raised the barrel of his gun to his forehead. I forced myself to watch as he cocked the pistol with a thumb. "This is for the good of the state. These people betrayed their state. They deserve this," were the thoughts I forced through my head. I even managed to muster up a righteous anger towards them. I told myself that they were traitors, that they had this coming to them. At the brink of that horrible moment, however, something happened. Just as our senior officer was beginning to apply the deadly pressure to his weapon, a log came flying out of the darkness. The projectile smacked him directly in the left side of his torso. It was apparently flying with a tremendous force. When it hit him, he was immediately knocked to the ground with a terrible screech of pain. His flashlight dropped to the ground and shut off from the jolt. We were all plunged into darkness. The quick, violent movement made my instincts kick in. Despite being immersed in darkness, I instantly grabbed my trigger and, as best as I could tell, spun in the direction the log had come from to let off a barrage of fire. The other 2 officers did the same. Haphazardly, we fired over a dozen shots into the dark. We quickly realized the futility of this, however, and ceased fire. The 6 prisoners remained fully intact, though they all forcefully shook in fear now. "Who's there?" called one of the officers as he, like the other officer and I, peered into the darkness. But to no avail. It was pitch black now. Our eyes were adjusting only slowly. None of us could see anything, but a singular fear was growing in all of our minds. All the East Germans knew about things like this happening, the police especially. Everyone had heard about East German government operations being appended and sabotaged. Everyone knew the stories about people escaping to the West with the aid of a force that could get through all the military defenses. The East German government tried to discredit the stories, but everyone on the police force was dreadfully aware that they were true. All these exploits were credited to a single man, a man with enough strength and nimbleness to take on a whole battalion, single-handedly. "Carsten Schadler," muttered the other officer under his breath. He voiced what we were all thinking. For several minutes, 3 of us turned about in circles, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever had thrown that log at our now incapacitated commanding officer. The only noises to be heard were the shifting of our boots in the loose dirt and the pounding of our own veins in our heads. An almost superstitious fear loomed in our hearts. Everyone feared Shadler like he was a monster of a man. There were so many stories about him, all unbelievable, that it was hard to know what was truth and what was myth. As the quiet dragged on, our nerves tensed to a point harder than steel. Suddenly, there was a loud rustle from a tree above our heads. All at once, all of us snapped our barrels in the direction and fired. But, before a few wild rounds were fired, we all noticed that the sound had been caused by a big stone being thrown into the tree. We saw it fall to the dirt with a thump. I instantly recognized a distraction, but by that point it was too late. Another log came whirling toward us. It flew diagonally in front of one of the officers next to the prisoners and smashed into the chest of the other officer. It smashed into several pieces on him as he simultaneously flew backward to the dirt. The second flying log was directly followed by a lightning-fast figure. He had to have been moving almost as fast as a car. The officer he lunged for hardly had time to raise his gun before he smashed him into his chest with his left shoulder. The blow that the officer received was so powerful that it sent him rolling for almost 10 feet right past me. Having shoved the officer out of his way, however, the man was left standing entirely exposed. I swung up my rifle and fired directly at him, but he quickly dug his heels into the dirt and made a tremendous leap. Moving at a high speed, he flew over 15 feet over the ground, arcing nearly 10 feet above it, and tackled me. Standing over me after having shoved me to the dirt, he grabbed my gun. I tried as hard as I could to keep hold of my weapon, gripping with white knuckles, but he ripped it from my grasp as easily as a man taking a toy from a baby. He ripped the rifle out of my hands and chucked it some 100 feet into the trunk of a tree where I heard a terrible rending of metal. With my rifle gone, I fell back, terrified. A superhuman stood over me while I had no means of protection. I didn't have a clue what he'd do to me, but he didn't seem very interested in me once he'd removed my weapon. For, the moment he threw my gun, he stepped off me and darted over to where the commanding officer was lying. I turned my head to look. Through a gap between two of the prisoners, who were still kneeling petrified between us, I saw my commanding officer beginning to stir. Shadler, I deduced by this point that the man attacking us was indeed Karsten Shadler, ran over to him and kicked him down. He then promptly bent down and grabbed his pistol away from him. He tossed the pistol the same way he'd tossed my rifle. My commanding officer groaned in anger. Shadler then turned around and took the weapon lying next to the first of the officers he'd taken out. He disposed of it as well. After throwing the gun, he dashed around to the back of the prisoners and took the final remaining weapon, which the officer that he'd sent rolling had dropped upon impact, and got rid of it. Once Shadler had removed all the guns, he walked more slowly to the front of the prisoners. From where I was lying, I saw him look down at them with a kindly smile. It was then that I began to study his physical features. I hadn't before because he'd been moving too quickly. I was interested in his appearance because, despite all the stories about him, no one knew for sure what he looked like. He was wearing what appeared to be a German infantry's uniform from the First World War, with the tall black boots and long dark green tunic, except he had tattered blue jeans on his legs. Under the grayish-green tunic, I could tell the man had an iron-solid figure. I was surprised, however, to see that he was relatively short. He stood, I estimated, no taller than 5 feet and 8 inches. It was even more surprising to see how young he looked, younger than me. He had curly dark brown hair that was wild on top, but close-cropped on the sides, with sideburns running down to his jaw. His brow was firm, and on either side of his long, narrow nose were 2 bright and lively blue eyes. Dirt coated almost his whole body. "You don't have to be afraid any more," said Shadler. The prisoners all looked up at him. I couldn't see their faces, but their quivering seemed to calm. "I'm going to get you out of here and take you to the West, if you want to go anyway." He looked at them seriously. None of them made any negative signs. I got the sense that no one wanted to stay here. Just then, however, the senior officer behind Shadler climbed to his feet. He stood up unsteadily and took an inconspicuous shuffle backward away from Shadler. The prisoners all looked at him in terror. Realizing that something was happening behind him, Karsten turned back. He looked at the man unfazed. My commanding officer returned the unmoved expression with one of utter loathing. "On your feet, men!" called our commander. The first officer who Shadler had taken out climbed up and darted over to the senior officer. The other officer seemed to be unconscious, while I felt too afraid to rise. Only the two men stood up in opposition to Shadler. The senior officer looked ashamed of his meager support, but didn't back down because of it. "You'll leave here right now," he commanded Shadler fiercely. "I may not have any weapons with which to threaten you, but whole legions of military might will come after you should you waylay this operation any longer. And I personally promise to do all that is in the power of my two hands to keep you from further disrupting us." The senior officer and his man behind him were two well-built, imposing, uniformed figures, yet Shadler looked at them unimpressed. The men didn't pose a threat in his eyes. He knew that he could easily take them both out, especially considering that neither had guns anymore. But his stare at them wasn't angry. He looked at them almost pityingly. "Look here, gentlemen. Despite how much I like smacking you around, there doesn't have to be any more violence between us. Just walk away from this right now. So long as you don't get in my way again, you won't hear from me," said Shadler diplomatically. The senior officer spit into the dirt. "What makes you think we're going to just walk away?" he asked scornfully. "I think you should walk away because, if you don't, I will have to beat you again, and if you push even further, I may have to kill you. I'm fully capable of doing both. I think I've already proven that." The men fell into silence. Karsten stared at them tensely, while they both stared back hatefully. "What's your decision, then?" asked Karsten after a minute. Both men spit on the dirt. "We'll send you to hell!" proclaimed the commanding officer in rage. He then darted forward at Shadler. His man followed his lead. Shadler didn't hesitate 1 second. He launched himself forward at them. He spread his arms straight out and knocked them both down by hitting them under the chin. They fell backward, head first, crashing into the dirt. The senior officer rolled over as fast as he could and got up. The other officer followed more slowly. The commanding officer man rose with his fists up. "You will lose this fight," Karsten warned him as he slowly rose his own fists. The man looked enraged. His face became tomato red. He made a quick forward jab with his right fist. Karsten easily dodged the blow. The man pulled backward for a moment and then threw himself forward with all his energy. He led his entire body with a right hook, swinging with a loud yell. Karsten leaned back to avoid it. While the senior man was off balance, Karsten delivered a swift uppercut. The blow landed square under the man's jaw with such power that he flew nearly 5 feet backward. While Shadler was still recovering his footing from the blow he delivered, the other officers came up behind. Caught off guard, the officer got in a good punch to the back of his head. Karsten stumbled forward with a pained groan. The officer tried to immediately follow up his successful punch with another, but Karsten jumped out of range. The officer swung his fist fruitlessly through empty space. Karsten darted back toward the man and spun on his right foot. He swung his left foot with a crushing force into the man's chest. The man, like his superior, went flying backward and hit the dirt unconscious. I came to discover later that most of his ribs were broken. With the commanding man and his officer taken down, Shadler turned back to the prisoners. He was surprised by what he saw, however. While the 3 men fought, I'd gotten up and taken my knife from inside my coat. I knew that they'd lose a fight against Shadler, so I quickly improvised a new plan to salvage the situation. I came up from behind the young woman prisoner and pulled her to her feet after putting a knife to her throat. When Karsten turned back to the prisoners, he saw me with one arm around the girl's waist to hold her firmly, and the other holding a big knife to her throat. I walked her slowly backward away from the other prisoners and Karsten. Immediately upon seeing the new situation, Shadler held up his hands. "Listen here," I said with my best attempt at ferocity, despite how terrified I was. "I'm going to take all these prisoners to our truck and drive them out of here back to Erfurt. This one," I motioned to the girl I held in my deadly grip, will ride in the front with me. Should you attempt another rescue, I'll slit her throat with my knife. Do you understand? I said, looking at him savagely. He stared back with fear in his eyes, though he also looked sad. What about these men? Asked Karsten, motioning to the unconscious officers lying across the hollow. We can pick them up later. They hardly matter anyway. They failed to protect their prisoners. Now, enough talk. You five, get up, I called as fiercely as I could to the other prisoners. All of them looked uncertainly at Karsten. He gave them a slow nod. They rose to their feet and turned sheepishly to follow me. All their hands were still cuffed. The 5 prisoners remained spread in a line, following me and the girl I held, as we walked backward toward the truck. I kept my eyes fixed on Shadler. He stepped, very slowly, after us. Don't follow, I warned him. But he didn't listen. He only slowed down a little more. I understand you're afraid, but I'm not afraid, I lied fiercely. You are, Shadler persisted. You wouldn't be here if you weren't afraid of your government, and you wouldn't be holding the knife to that poor girl's throat if you weren't afraid of me. Fear is driving everything you're doing right now, said Shadler as he looked at me compassionately. Shut up, I shouted, but once again he ignored me and stayed his course. You don't need to be afraid, though. Fear isn't good for a man. We should live our lives in boldness. I will kill her, I shouted with even more ferocity than before. I stopped and pressed the narrow blade closer to her throat. It drew a little drop of blood. She let out a frightened squeal. Karsten stopped suddenly and raised his hands higher. All right. We all want to get out of this for the better. So can we just talk honestly for a minute? There was a tense silence before he continued. Your only bargaining chip is that girl you hold in your grip. I may not be fast enough to stop you from killing her, but you can be damn sure that if you do, I will be fast enough to kill you before you can kill anyone else. Darling, Karsten looked sorrowfully into the girl's eyes. I'm so sorry that you're in this position, he said genuinely, but I must ask you to make a decision. Will you let me wager your life against the madness of this boy? Say yes, and I'll do my best to get everyone out of here alive. Say no, and I'll let him take you away. I'm not going to wager anyone's life without their consent. But you should remember that if he takes you, you'll probably die anyway. And the other 5 will too. All the same, it's up to you. Not if you'll allow it. Shake if you won't. Nervousness overwhelmed me. I felt myself quickly losing my grasp on this situation. I knew Karsten was right. If I killed her, which I had absolutely no desire to do, I'd lose any control of the situation, and he'd kill me in revenge for her. I felt totally helpless. I hoped that she'd shake her head no, and he'd let me just walk away. But, even then, I didn't like the idea of what would happen when we got back to the station in Erfurt. All these people would be killed, and maybe me along with them. All my options were bleak. As I evaluated the circumstances in my head, the thing that I most feared happened. The girl bravely nodded her head. Karsten's eyes darted up to mine. Did you see that? He asked me. My heart pounded, but I didn't loose my grip, nor did I slide the knife. I remained tense. She's willing to die to save these people. That's courage. In the face of death, she chose to do what's right, rather than what's easy. That's the way people are supposed to live. Why do I feel like he's right? Why is my conscience telling me that I'm in the wrong, that I'm the criminal? These were the thoughts racing through my head. I can't allow you to have them, I said hoarsely to Shadler. It was the only thing I could think to say, because it was true. If I let him have them, I knew I'd be killed for sure. Tell me this. Do you think she should die? Do you think any of them should die? I didn't answer, but the weight of the question nearly crushed me. You know that she shouldn't die. You know that these men and women have done nothing to deserve this. I can see it in your eyes that you haven't been corrupted by your society yet. You're still young. They haven't killed all the truth inside you yet. You know what you're doing is wrong. You're only doing it because you're scared. Don't be scared. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow. I know you're afraid of what they'll do to you, but the one mightier than I promises that the righteous will be rewarded. And this is righteousness. No matter what happens, preserving the lives of these innocent people will be for your ultimate benefit. That I can promise you." I felt tears run down my face. It felt like he was pulling all the doubts I'd ever had about the life I'd lived from my heart. It felt like he was tearing down all the facades of certainty that I'd built for myself. "How can you be sure?" I asked in a shaking voice. Shadler took a gentle step forward. "An evil man can die in his cushy bed and go to hell, while a righteous man can be killed on a battlefield and go to the worlds above. Evil will always destroy. Maybe it won't destroy other people, but it'll always destroy you. Your conscience can confirm that," said Shadler firmly. The tears came more quickly. It was all so painful, but I knew what I had to do. I lowered my shaking hand from the girl's neck. Dropping the knife to the dirt, I stepped away from her. She moaned in relief. I pulled a ring of keys from my pocket and threw them at Shadler. With my keys in his hands, Shadler stepped forward quickly and uncuffed all the prisoners. Meanwhile, I fell to my knees and sobbed uncontrollably. Once all the men and women were freed, they stepped away from me and stood behind Shadler. I couldn't blame them. I felt like a monster. That's why I sobbed. I didn't understand how I could possibly live with myself, knowing what I'd almost done, knowing what I'd helped others do. So much death, so much evil, and there was no end in sight. Karsten walked up to me and put a hand on my shoulder. He knelt down and looked into my eyes pityingly. I looked back. "What am I supposed to do now? They'll kill me once they find out what I've done. Or worse, they'll make me commit more atrocities," I asked Karsten helplessly. He patted my shoulder. "Come with us to the West. You can help people there. You can do good." I looked at him surprised. Not more than 10 minutes ago I tried to kill him, and now he was asking me to come with him? What kind of a man was this Shadler? I could see in his eyes, however, that he meant what he said. At the time, I didn't understand it. But even without understanding what could drive this man to be so willing to forgive, I knew I had to go with him. So that's what I did. That night, May 21st, 1980, I followed Karsten Shadler into West Germany and began a new life. I hardly knew what was happening at the time, but I allowed my life to be changed. In time, I learned that Shadler was different from anyone I'd ever known. I'd spent my life around the type of people who only helped me if it suited them. But Karsten was a man who was willing to sacrifice for me. He was willing to risk everything for the people he cared about, and there was a lot of them, too. Even though he had enough strength in his body to lift a stack of cars, he was faster to use words than force. He lived an exemplary life to us all. It was no wonder his name later spread across all of Europe, and even the world. After the incident in 1980, years went by. Little by little, my life changed. Eventually, Karsten's example inspired me to return to the East. Telling them stories about being kidnapped, I even managed to return to my job on the police force. But I came back for very different reasons than I'd first started. I don't have superhuman abilities like my friend, Shadler, so I decided I'd help promote righteousness a different way. It hasn't been easy to do what I've done for these past few years, but I've managed to save lives by feeding Karsten information and blocking all the evils I can. The number of lives I've helped save isn't that high, if I'm honest, but I've aided Karsten as much as possible. And, as he tells me, every life is worth an infinity. So even though the numbers are meager, I remain happy. Even now, I remain happy. I've received news that my affiliations with Karsten Shadler, who is officially recognized as a terrorist by the GDR, have come to light. Even as I write this, I know that officers have been dispatched to my location. Given that I'm the one who usually told Karsten about innocent Germans in need of extraction, and that my line of communicating with him has been cut, I don't think I'll be saved like the others. I'll likely be killed the same way we were meant to kill those 6 prisoners back in 1980. A bullet through the back of the head in a dark forest where no one will find my bones for a very long time. My name is Klaus Mueller, and I am writing this memoir in hopes that it will make it into the world one day. I want everyone to know the story of how Carsten Shadler saved me from becoming a monster, in hopes that it may save others from a similar fate. Because it is true that, left to myself, I'd have become exactly like the men who were willing to kill without a just cause. The only difference between them and me is that I was told the truth before it was too late. And I want it to be known that I am dying without regret. I hold my head high, for I am proud to die for Diamond and the God whose word he stood for.